It was an ordinary school day for James. He packed his backpack, grabbed his lunch, and headed out the door, just like any other day. His father gave him a quick smile and a pat on the back, sending him off with encouraging words. "Have a great day, son. Remember to be kind and do your best." James nodded and ran out of the house, feeling the warmth of his father's love. At school, the bell rang, signaling the start of another busy day. James sat at his desk, excited to get through the school day and finally eat his lunch. It was his favorite time of the day, a peaceful break from all the classes and lessons. He looked forward to his lunch hour when he could enjoy a few moments of peace away from the classroom chatter. But there was something bothering him recently, something he couldn't explain. For weeks now, James had noticed that his lunch was mysteriously disappearing. It started with small things. He'd find his sandwich missing a bite, or his fruit almost gone. At first, he didn't think much of it, but soon, the strange pattern became impossible to ignore. Every day when he opened his lunchbox, something was missing. It wasn't just a few bites here and there. The food was disappearing entirely. James tried to ignore it, but the more it happened, the more it started to bother him. He didn't want to believe it, but it seemed like someone was taking his lunch. At first, he thought maybe it was one of the other kids, but they always seemed to act so innocent, too busy with their own food to take his. He began to feel uneasy in the lunchroom, unsure of who to trust. No one seemed to notice what was happening to his lunch. Every day, as the lunch bell rang, James would anxiously sit down with his friends, trying to act normal. But deep down, he felt nervous. The food in his lunchbox wasn't enough to satisfy his hunger anymore, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, waiting for him to leave the lunchbox unattended. It was becoming too much for him to handle. James had always been a quiet, shy boy, and he didn't know how to speak up about something like this. He didn't want to cause trouble, especially not over something as simple as food. Each day, he found himself eating less and less. Sometimes, he would just take a few bites and push the rest aside, pretending he wasn't hungry. He didn't want to risk his lunch disappearing again, so he tried to make it look like he wasn't bothered. But the emptiness in his stomach grew, and so did the unease in his heart. After a few weeks of this, James started to feel embarrassed. How could he tell anyone about this? What would people think if they knew he couldn't even keep his own lunch safe? His classmates had no idea what was going on. To them, James was just the quiet kid who always ate alone, never complaining, never causing a fuss. They didn't notice that something was wrong, and James didn't know how to make them see it. Every time he opened his lunchbox, he hoped, just hoped, that today would be the day he'd have a full meal. But that hope quickly faded as he saw the familiar empty spots where his food should have been. By now, he had almost given up. The days felt longer, and lunch wasn't the break he had once enjoyed. It had become a time filled with anxiety, disappointment, and hunger. But little did James know, his father had noticed something was off too. His father had always been there for him, listening to his worries and offering solutions when things got tough. Now, it was time for him to step in. James had no idea that the solution was just around the corner, and that his father was about to change everything for him. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just his lunch going missing anymore. It was the weight of the worry that seemed to follow him each day. Every time he opened his lunchbox, he felt a pang of disappointment when he saw that more food had disappeared. It was as though someone was sneaking in, taking what was his, and leaving no trace. At first, he thought he could just ignore it, that maybe he was imagining things. But as the days went on, he realized that it wasn't just a coincidence. Someone, or something, was taking his lunch. At school, James didn't talk much. He kept to himself, mostly focused on his books or playing by himself during recess. His friends never seemed to notice what was happening with his food. They were all too busy chatting and enjoying their own lunches. James didn't want to tell anyone. He didn't want to sound like a tattletale or make anyone feel bad, especially not the teacher. But he couldn't help but feel more and more uncomfortable with every passing day. One afternoon, as he sat in the lunchroom, trying to eat what little he had left in his lunchbox, James watched as the other kids laughed and talked with each other. He wished he could be as carefree as they were, but the thought of his lunch being taken yet again made his stomach twist. He had brought something different today, something he really liked. But it wasn't even halfway through lunch before he noticed that part of it was gone. He stared down at his lunch, feeling that familiar mix of confusion and frustration. He glanced around the room, trying to spot anyone who might have seen something. His eyes wandered from one person to another, but no one seemed to care or even look his way. That was when it hit him. Whoever was taking his food wasn't just sneaking bites. They were taking whole portions, and no one had noticed. James started feeling small, like he didn't matter. Maybe he was just too quiet, too invisible. Why else would this be happening to him? What if the teacher was taking his lunch? Could that really be possible? He hadn't thought about it before, but the idea was now nagging at him. He remembered how the teacher always seemed to be around when the bell rang for lunch, walking by the students, talking to them as they ate. Maybe it was all too much of a coincidence. As the days went on, James grew more withdrawn. He stopped looking forward to lunch, stopped feeling excited to open his lunchbox. Each day felt like another day of waiting for his food to disappear. He didn't know how to ask for help. He was afraid that if he told anyone, they wouldn't believe him. What if they thought he was lying? He didn't want to make things worse, so he kept quiet. But deep down, the silence was eating away at him. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine. He was starving, and it wasn't just because of the missing food. It was the feeling of helplessness, the loneliness that came with not being able to talk to anyone about what was really happening. No one knew, and it felt like no one cared. James was starting to lose hope that anyone would ever find out the truth. But little did he know, his father was already starting to piece together the puzzle, watching closely and noticing the change in his son's behavior. Something needed to be done. James's father had always been attentive. He noticed things that other people didn't. He could tell when something was bothering his son, even if James tried to hide it behind a smile. Lately, James had been different. He wasn't his usual energetic self when he came home from school. He wasn't talking as much about his day, and that worried his father. His son, who had always been excited to share stories, was now quieter than ever. One evening after dinner, James's father sat down with him at the kitchen table. The room was warm and cozy, the light from the overhead lamp casting a soft glow. James poked at his food absent-mindedly, his mind clearly elsewhere. His father watched him for a moment before speaking gently. "James, is everything all right at school?" James hesitated. He didn't want to trouble his father, didn't want to make him worried over something so small, but the pressure of it all was building up inside him. He had been holding it in for so long, afraid that no one would understand. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked at his father. "Dad, I think someone's been taking my lunch at school. Every day, it's like it disappears. I don't know who, but it's been happening for weeks now." His father's face changed. There was concern in his eyes, but there was also a spark of determination. "What do you mean your lunch disappears?" he asked, trying to understand the situation more clearly. James explained how he had noticed his food slowly vanishing, how it wasn't just a small bite here and there, but whole portions were missing. "I don't know who's doing it, Dad, but it's like they know when I turn my back. I can't explain it." His father listened carefully, nodding as he took in every word. "James, I'm really sorry this has been happening to you. No one should take your lunch, especially not at school." He paused, thinking for a moment. "But we're going to get to the bottom of this. I'll help you, son." James looked up at him, unsure of what his father meant, but feeling a small spark of hope. It was the first time in a while that he felt like someone understood. The next day, James's father decided to take action. He knew his son well enough to understand that this wasn't something James could handle on his own, and he wasn't going to let his son suffer in silence any longer. His mind raced with different ideas. He wanted to protect James, but he also wanted to give him the chance to learn how to handle this situation in his own way. So he began working on a plan. He didn't tell James about it right away, wanting it to be a surprise. James's father wanted to show him that he could take charge of a situation and come out stronger on the other side. He knew it was time for a lesson in standing up for himself, and he wasn't going to let the teacher or anyone else take advantage of his son. By the time James came home from school that afternoon, his father was ready. He smiled and ruffled James's hair. "I've got a plan. Tomorrow, you're going to walk into school with something special in your backpack." James looked confused but intrigued. "What do you mean? What's in the backpack?" His father grinned. "Don't worry about it, son. Just trust me. Tomorrow will be different." As James went to bed that night, he felt a little lighter. For the first time in weeks, he actually looked forward to the next school day. He didn't know what his father had planned, but whatever it was, he felt like it would make everything better. The next morning, James woke up feeling a strange mix of excitement and curiosity. His father's words echoed in his mind. Tomorrow will be different. He had no idea what his father had planned, but it was the first time in a long while that he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. As usual, James got dressed quickly and grabbed his backpack. His father was already in the kitchen, making breakfast. The smell of pancakes filled the air, and for a moment, James forgot about the worries that had weighed him down. His father gave him a knowing smile as he set the plate down in front of him. "I've packed your backpack for you today," he said, his tone light but filled with purpose. "You're going to need some extra strength today, son." James looked at his father, puzzled. Extra strength? For what? His father just smiled, ruffling his hair once more. "You'll see. Just trust me. Eat your breakfast, and then we'll go." James ate his pancakes, feeling a bit more relaxed now that he had his father's support. When he finished, his father handed him his backpack. It felt heavier than usual, and the contents seemed different. James glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, take a look." Curious, James unzipped the backpack and carefully began to pull out the items inside. The first thing he noticed was a note. It was folded neatly, with his father's handwriting on the outside. He unfolded it and read, "James, today is the day you take control. No one has the right to take what's yours. If anyone tries, you'll have something special in your bag to remind you that you're strong enough to stand up for yourself. Don't let anyone make you feel small. I believe in you." James felt a warmth spread through him as he read the note. It wasn't just about the lunch anymore. It was about standing up for himself. His father had always believed in him, but this felt different. It felt like a promise, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. Inside the bag, along with the note, James found something he hadn't expected. His father had packed his favorite sandwich, of course, but there was also something else, a small, shiny object wrapped carefully in a cloth. James unwrapped it and found a keychain. It was a simple one, but it had a small silver star on it. It wasn't just a regular keychain. It was a symbol of something his father had always told him. "You have a star inside you, James. Never forget that." The keychain was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of his father's support, a reminder that he wasn't just a passive bystander in his own life. Today, he had the power to change things. He had the strength to speak up, to confront whatever, or whoever, had been taking his lunch. "Thank you, Dad," James said quietly, feeling his chest tighten with emotion. He didn't know exactly what would happen at school, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't face it alone. His father had shown him that there was always a way to stand up for himself, even in the most difficult of situations. As James put the keychain back in his backpack, he looked at his father one last time before heading out the door. "I'll be okay, Dad," he said with more confidence than he'd felt in weeks. His father nodded, his smile full of pride. "I know you will be, James. I know you will be." With that, James stepped out into the world, ready for whatever the day would bring. He didn't know if today would be the day he finally found out who had been taking his lunch. But he did know that he was going to face it with a new sense of courage, one that came from the love and belief his father had shown him. The school day began like any other, but there was something different in the air today. James could feel it. As he walked through the gates, carrying his backpack a little taller on his shoulders, he had a quiet sense of purpose. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You have the strength inside you to make this right." The weight of the keychain in his bag reminded him that today was going to be different. Today, he wouldn't sit back and let things happen. He was going to stand up for himself. The usual chatter filled the hallways as James made his way to class. His friends greeted him with smiles, but James wasn't quite as focused on their conversations today. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about the lunchroom, about his food, and what might happen when the teacher came around. The nervous feeling still lingered in the pit of his stomach, but it was no longer as overwhelming. His father's support gave him the courage to face whatever was coming. As the lunch bell rang, James walked into the lunchroom, taking in the familiar sounds of kids chatting and laughing. It felt like any other day, until his eyes fell on the teacher. She was already walking around, checking on students and talking to them as they ate. James noticed her moving closer to his table, and his heart began to race. He didn't know if today would be the day she would take his lunch, but he was ready. He sat down at his usual spot, opening his lunchbox, and for a moment, he felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. His favorite sandwich was there, untouched, along with the fruit he always brought. But there was something else now, something different. With the keychain in his backpack, he felt more in control. He could do this. If she tried to take his food, he wouldn't let it happen. The teacher, as usual, walked past the students, stopping to chat with them, making her way closer to James. His breath caught in his throat as she came nearer. He was ready. When she stopped next to him, smiling down at him, James felt a surge of confidence that he hadn't felt before. The teacher leaned down slightly, as if to inspect his lunch. Before she could say anything, James looked up at her and said clearly, "I've packed this lunch for myself. Please don't take it today." The words came out of his mouth more firmly than he expected. For a moment, the teacher was silent, surprised by his directness. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't take the food. James felt the weight of her gaze, but he didn't back down. He sat up straighter, his hand firmly resting on the edge of his lunchbox. The teacher took a small step back, looking at him as if seeing him for the first time. She seemed to hesitate, perhaps unsure of how to respond. She had always taken his lunch without a second thought before, but today, something was different. James wasn't the same boy he had been. He wasn't the quiet, shy student who let things slide anymore. Today, he was standing his ground. "All right, James," the teacher said, her voice a little softer than before. "But next time, be sure to pack enough to share, okay?" James nodded, his heart still racing, but now with a sense of victory. He hadn't expected her to back off so easily, but she did. The power had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, James felt like he was in control of the situation. He looked down at his lunch, grateful that it was still there, untouched. As he finished eating, his classmates whispered among themselves, some of them looking at James with surprise. He didn't care. The important thing was that he had stood up for himself, and for the first time, he felt proud of it. The rest of the lunch period passed quietly, and when the bell rang to signal the end of lunch, James packed up his things with a new sense of confidence. He hadn't just kept his lunch today. He had shown that he wouldn't let anyone take advantage of him anymore. His father's support had given him the strength to face this challenge head-on. And as he walked back to class, he knew this was just the beginning. Today, he had taken the first step toward standing up for himself, and he wouldn't be going back. The rest of the day passed in a blur for James. He couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened in the lunchroom. He had actually stood up for himself. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of pride, something he hadn't experienced in a while. The anxiety that had been building inside him for so long seemed to vanish, replaced by a feeling of strength. James couldn't believe how easy it had been to speak up when the moment arrived. When the lunch bell rang and the students were called back to class, James walked with his head a little higher, his steps a bit more confident than before. His classmates noticed the change in him. Some of them whispered to each other, casting glances his way, but James didn't mind. He was too focused on what had just happened. He had faced his fear, and he had come out victorious. But the moment was far from over. As the class resumed, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. Maybe the teacher would act differently now that he had stood up to her. Maybe she would get angry or try to take his lunch again. James couldn't predict it, but he was ready. The confidence he felt earlier didn't fade. It stayed with him. Later in the day, the teacher gave the class a break to stretch and move around. James watched her carefully, half expecting her to walk past him again. But to his surprise, she didn't. Instead, she seemed to avoid looking in his direction. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but as the minutes passed, he realized that she was deliberately staying away from his table. This puzzled James. Why wasn't she trying to take his lunch? Had his words actually made a difference? Could it be that the teacher had actually heard him, understood him, and respected his space? James couldn't believe it. He hadn't expected such a quick response, but it seemed that the teacher had chosen to let things be for once. She wasn't interfering anymore. The rest of the day went on without any more incidents. James could hardly believe how smoothly everything had gone. At the end of the school day, when the bell rang for everyone to go home, James was one of the first to gather his things and head toward the door. His backpack felt a little heavier today, not from the lunch he had brought, but from the weight of the victory he had just experienced. It wasn't just about keeping his food. It was about standing up for himself, something he had never done before. And now, he was starting to believe that he could do it again whenever he needed to. When he reached home, his father was already there, waiting for him. The moment James stepped inside, his father looked up and smiled. "How was your day, son?" he asked, his voice filled with warmth and curiosity. James smiled back, feeling a deep sense of relief. "It went well, Dad. You were right. I stood up for myself, and she didn't take my lunch. Not today." His father's face lit up with pride. "I knew you could do it, James. I'm proud of you." James sat down at the kitchen table, sharing the details of his day with his father. As he spoke, he realized something important. He wasn't just talking about lunch anymore. He was talking about standing up for himself in a way that he had never done before. This moment had changed him, and he knew he was stronger than he had been before. The experience had taught him that he had the power to make a difference in his own life, and that he could face any challenge that came his way. That night, as James got ready for bed, he placed the small silver keychain his father had given him on his nightstand. The star on it gleamed softly in the dim light. He felt its weight again, but this time it was a reminder of something bigger: his own inner strength, his ability to stand tall, no matter the situation. He was ready for whatever the future would bring. The days that followed felt different for James. He walked through the school halls with a new sense of pride that he had never experienced before. It wasn't just about keeping his lunch safe anymore. It was about knowing that he had the strength to stand up for himself when it mattered. Every time he passed by the lunchroom, he felt the familiar weight of the keychain in his backpack, reminding him of the victory he had achieved and the support his father had given him. James noticed that his classmates treated him a little differently too. Some of them, who had once ignored him or even teased him, now looked at him with more respect. They didn't know exactly what had happened, but something had shifted. James could sense it in the way they looked at him, as if they suddenly saw him in a new light. It wasn't that he was looking for their approval, but it felt good to know that others recognized his strength. As the week went on, the teacher never tried to take his lunch again. In fact, she seemed to go out of her way to avoid him. making sure not to walk near his table. James wasn't sure if it was because she had been caught off guard or if she had simply decided to respect him after his direct request. Either way, he felt a sense of relief. He didn't need to worry anymore. He had spoken up, and things had changed for the better. But the biggest change was in how James viewed himself. Before, he had always been the quiet, shy boy who let things happen around him. He didn't like conflict, and he often kept his feelings hidden, hoping that things would work themselves out. But now, he knew better. He had learned that speaking up didn't have to be scary. It didn't have to lead to trouble. Instead, it could lead to respect and understanding. One afternoon, as James sat in the park after school, enjoying some time alone, he thought about how much had changed in such a short period. He realized that standing up for himself wasn't just about one incident. It was about the way he carried himself every day. The way he walked into school with his head held high. The way he spoke to others with more confidence. The way he understood that his voice mattered. That evening, when he got home, his father was there waiting for him. As always, James sat down with him at the kitchen table, ready to share how his day had gone. But this time, he wasn't just talking about the lunch situation. He was talking about how things had started to feel different in his life. He felt like he could face whatever came his way, no matter how big or small. His father listened intently, a proud smile on his face. "I'm so proud of you, James," he said, his voice warm with love and admiration. "You've learned something really important. You've learned that you don't have to let things happen to you. You have the power to make things happen." James felt his chest swell with pride. He had always known his father believed in him, but hearing it out loud made everything feel even more real. He wasn't just a quiet boy anymore. He was someone who had the courage to stand up for what was right, to speak up when it mattered, and to protect what was important to him. As he sat there with his father, James knew that this experience had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. But one thing was clear. He was no longer the same person he had been when this all started. He was stronger, more confident, and ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold. As the weeks passed, James continued to walk through his school days with a newfound confidence that seemed to grow stronger every day. He didn't just feel different, he was different. The boy who had once been unsure of himself, quiet and afraid to speak up, had found his voice, and it was something he could no longer ignore. His father's belief in him had lit a fire inside him, and that spark had turned into a steady flame that guided him through each day. James noticed that school had become a little easier. He wasn't as nervous in the hallways or at lunchtime anymore. He still ate his lunch by himself, but now he didn't feel like he was being watched. Nor did he worry about his food disappearing. Every day felt a little brighter, and the sense of dread he had once carried was now replaced by something else. Freedom. He had taken control of his own story, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as he sat in the park with his favorite book, enjoying the quiet of the moment, James thought about how far he had come. He had never imagined that standing up for himself would lead to such a change. It wasn't just about the teacher anymore. It was about him, his strength, and the realization that he had the power to make things right when something was wrong. He could handle whatever came his way because he had learned that his voice mattered, that his actions had weight. When he returned home that evening, his father was sitting in his usual spot, reading the newspaper. James dropped his backpack by the door and walked into the kitchen, where his father looked up and smiled. "How was your day, son?" he asked, as always, but this time, James could feel the difference in the way he answered. "It was good, Dad," James said, his voice steady. "Really good. I think I've figured out that it's not just about standing up for myself in situations like lunch. It's about knowing I can handle anything. I feel like I can take on whatever comes next." His father set the newspaper down and looked at him, a proud smile spreading across his face. "I knew you had it in you," he said. "You've learned something that not everyone figures out. You've learned that you're strong enough to face whatever comes your way, and that's a gift." James felt a warmth spread through him at his father's words. It wasn't just about the incident with his lunch anymore. The lesson he had learned went far beyond that. He had learned to speak up for what was right, to face challenges head-on, and to trust in himself. That night, as he prepared for bed, James placed the silver keychain on his nightstand once again. It wasn't just a reminder of his victory over the lunch situation. It was a reminder of everything he had become. It was a symbol of his strength, his courage, and the unwavering support he had from his father. The star on the keychain shone softly in the dim light, and James felt a sense of peace settle over him. As he lay in bed, thinking about the future, he knew that he wasn't the same boy who had once been afraid to speak up. He was stronger now, ready to face anything life threw his way. And with his father's belief in him, James knew he had the strength to tackle any challenge with confidence, knowing that his voice would always be heard.